Hey folks, welcome to Paper Chain Narrations. Today we'll be reading the first chapter of The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks. Terry Brooks wrote a series called Shannara, and he has a second one that's called Pre-Shannara. And there is a bajillion books in here, and honestly, I did not know that this series existed until a couple months ago. So I haven't read most of the material. I read a little bit of a couple chapters of the book that we're going to be reading, which means my commentary for the first couple chapters will probably be way less than I normally will end up doing, but I loved it and I was thinking about making an audiobooks channel anyway, so I just figured I would start with this one, even though I have no idea past chapter 10. So yeah, that's gonna be a great idea. Disclaimers for this chapter will be listed on the screen now. Please click out if you're uncomfortable or unable to listen to these themes. If not, curl up with your favorite blanket, a drink, maybe a snack, or do whatever you're wanting to do while this is playing. And let's get right to it. Chapter 1. The sun was already sinking into the deep green of the hills to the west of the valley, the red and gray-pink of its shadows touching the corners of the land when Flick Omsford began his descent. The trail stretched out unevenly down the northern slope, winding through the huge boulders which studded the rugged terrain in massive clumps, disappearing into the thick forests of the lowlands to reappear in brief glimpses of small clearings and thinning spaces of woodland. Flick followed the familiar trail with his eyes as he trudged wearily along, his pack slung loosely over one shoulder. His broad, wind-burned face bore a set, placid look, and only the wide gray eyes revealed the restless energy that burned beneath the calm exterior. He was a young man, though his stocky build and the grizzled brown hair and shaggy eyebrows made him look much older. He wore the loose-fitting work clothes of the Vale people, and in the pack he carried were several metal implements that rolled and clanked loosely against one another. There was a slight chill in the evening air, and Flick clutched the collar of his open wool shirt closer to his neck. His journey ahead lay through forests and rolling flatlands, the latter not yet visible to him as he passed into the forests, and the darkness of the tall oaks and somber hickories reached upward to overlap and blot out the cloudless night sky. The sun had set, leaving only the deep blue of the heavens pinpointed by thousands of friendly stars. The huge trees shut out even these, and Flick was left alone in the silent darkness as he moved slowly along the beaten path. Because he had traveled the same route 100 times, the young man noticed immediately the unusual stillness that seemed to have captivated the chirping of insects normally present in the quiet of the night, the cries of the birds that awoke with the setting of the sun to fly in search of food. All were missing. Flick listened intently for some sound of life, but his keen ears could detect nothing. He shook his head uneasily. The deep silence was unsettling, particularly in view of the rumors of a frightening black-winged creature sighted in the night skies north of the valley only days earlier. He forced himself to whistle and turned his thoughts back to his day's work in the country just to the north of the Vale, where outlying families farmed and tended domestic livestock. He traveled to their homes every week, supplying various items they required and bringing bits of news on the happenings of the Vale and occasionally the distant cities of the deep Southland. Few people knew the surrounding countryside as well as he did, and fewer still cared to travel beyond the comparative safety of their homes in the valley. Men were more inclined to remain in isolated communities these days and let the rest of the world get along as best it could. But Flick liked to travel outside the valley from time to time, and the outlying homesteads were in need of his services and were willing to pay him for the trouble. Flick's father was not one to let an opportunity pass him by where there was money to be made, and the arrangement seemed to work out well for all concerned. Sounds like he was voluntold to do that, alright? A low-hanging branch brushing against his head caused Flick to start suddenly and leap to one side. In chagrin, he straightened himself and glared back at the leafy obstacle before continuing his journey at a slightly quicker pace. He was deep in the lowland forests now, and only slivers of moonlight were able to find their way through the thick boughs overhead to light the winding path dimly. It was so dark that Flick was having trouble finding the trail, and as he studied the lay of the land ahead, he again found himself conscious of the heavy silence. It was as if all life had suddenly been extinguished, and he alone remained to find his way out of this forest tomb. Again, he recalled the strange rumors. He felt a bit anxious in spite of himself and glanced worriedly around. But nothing stirred on the trail ahead, nor moved in the trees about him, and he felt embarrassingly relieved. Pausing momentarily in a moonlit clearing, he gazed at the fullness of the night sky before passing abruptly into the trees beyond. He walked slowly, picking his way along the winding path that had narrowed beyond the clearing and now seemed to disappear into a wall of trees and bushes ahead. He knew that it was merely an illusion, but found himself glancing about uneasily all the same. A few moments later, he was again on a wider trail and could discern bits of sky peeking through the heavy trees. He was almost to the bottom of the valley and about 2 miles from his home. He smiled and began whistling an old tavern song as he hurried on. He was so intent on the trail ahead and the open land beyond the forest that he failed to notice the huge black shadow that seemed to rise up suddenly, detaching itself from a great oak tree on his left and moving swiftly toward the path to intercept him. The dark figure was almost on top of the Veilman before Flick sensed its presence, looming up before him like a great black stone which threatened to crush his smaller being. With a startled cry of fear, he leaped aside, his pack falling to the path with a crash of metal, and his left hand whipped out the long, thin dagger at his waist. Even as he crouched to defend himself, he was stayed by a commanding arm raised above the figure before him in a strong yet reassuring voice that spoke out quickly. "Wait a moment, friend. I am no enemy and have no wish to harm you. I merely seek directions and would be grateful if you would show me the proper path." Flick relaxed his guard a bit and tried to peer into the blackness of the figure before him in an effort to discover some semblance of a human being. He could see nothing, however, and he moved to the left with cautious steps in an attempt to catch the features of the dark figure in the tree-shadowed moonlight. "I assure you, I mean no harm," the voice continued, as if reading the Veilman's mind. "I did not mean to frighten you, but I didn't see you until you were almost upon me, and I was afraid you might pass me by without realizing I was there." The voice stopped, and the huge black figure stood silently, though Flick could feel the eyes following him as he edged about the path to put his own back to the light. Slowly, the pale moonlight began to etch out the stranger's features in vague lines and blue shadows. For a long moment the two faced one another in silence, each studying the other. Flick in an effort to decide what it was that he faced, the stranger in quiet anticipation. Then, suddenly, the huge figure lunged with terrible swiftness, his powerful hands seizing the Veilman's wrists, and Flick was lifted abruptly off the solid earth and held high, his knife dropping from nerveless fingers as the deep voice laughed mockingly up at him. "Well, well, my young friend, what are you going to do now, I wonder? I could cut your heart out on the spot and leave you for the wolves if I chose, couldn't I?" Flick struggled violently to free himself, terror numbing his mind to any thought but that of escape. He had no idea what manner of creature had subdued him, but it was far more powerful than any normal man, and apparently prepared to dispatch Flick quickly. Then abruptly his captor held him out at an arm's length, and the mocking voice became icy cold with displeasure. "Enough of this, boy. We've played our little game, and still you know nothing of me. I'm tired and hungry and have no wish to be delayed on the forest trail in the chill of the evening while you decide if I'm man or beast. I will set you down that you may show me the path. I warn you, do not try to run from me, or it will be the worse for you." The strong voice trailed off, and the tone of displeasure disappeared as the former hint of mockery returned with a short laugh. "Besides," the figure rumbled as the fingers released their iron grip, and Flick slipped to the path, "I may be a better friend than you realize." The figure moved back a step as Flick straightened himself, rubbing his wrist carefully to restore circulation to his numbed hands. He wanted to run, but was certain that the stranger could catch him again, and this time finish him off without further thought. He leaned over cautiously and picked up the fallen dagger, returning it to his belt. Flick could see the fellow more clearly now, and a quick scrutiny of him revealed that he was definitely human, though much larger than any man Flick had ever seen. He was at least 7 feet tall and exceptionally lean, though it was difficult to be certain about this, since his tall frame was wrapped in a flowing black cloak with a loose cowl pulled close about his head. The darkened face was long and deeply lined, giving it a craggy appearance. The eyes were deep-set and almost completely hidden from view by shaggy eyebrows that nodded fiercely over a long, flat nose. A short black beard outlined a wide mouth that was just a line on the face, a line that never seemed to move. The overall appearance was frightening, all blackness and size, and Flick had to fight down the urge building within him to make a break for the forest's edge. He looked straight into the deep, hard eyes of the stranger, though not without some difficulty, and managed a weak smile. "I thought you were a thief," he mumbled hesitantly. "You were mistaken," was the quiet retort. Then the voice softened a bit. "You must know a friend from an enemy. Sometime your life may depend on it. Now then, let's have your name." "Flick Omsford?" Flick hesitated, and then continued in a slightly braver tone of voice. "My father is Curzat Omsford. He manages an inn in Shady Vale, a mile or 2 from here. You could find lodging and food there." "Ah, Shady Vale!" the stranger exclaimed suddenly. "Yes, that is where I'm going." He paused, as if reflecting on his own words. Flick watched him cautiously as he rubbed his craggy face with crooked fingers and looked beyond the forest's edge to the rolling grasslands of the valley. He was still looking away when he spoke again. "You have a brother." It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact. It was spoken so distantly and calmly, as if the tall stranger were not at all interested in any sort of a reply, that Flick almost missed hearing it. Then, suddenly realizing the significance of the remark, he started and looked quickly at the other. "How did—" "Oh, well," the man said, "doesn't every young Valeman like yourself have a brother somewhere?" Flick nodded dumbly, unable to comprehend what it was the other was trying to say, and wondering vaguely how much he knew about Shady Vale. The stranger was looking questioningly at him, evidently waiting to be guided to the promised food and lodging. Flick quickly turned away to find his hastily discarded pack, picked it up, and slung it over his shoulder, looking back at the figure towering over him. "The path is this way," he pointed, and the two began walking. They passed out of the forest and entered rolling, gentle hills, which they would follow to the hamlet of Shady Vale at the far end of the valley. Out of the woods, it was a bright night. The moon was a full white globe overhead, its glow clearly illuminating the landscape of the valley and the path which the two travelers were following. The path itself was a vague line winding over grassy hills and distinguishable only by occasional rain-washed ruts and flat, hard patches of earth breaking through the heavy grass. The wind had gathered strength and rushed at the two men with quick gusts that whipped at their clothing as they walked, forcing them to bow their heads slightly to shield their eyes. Neither spoke a word as they proceeded, each concentrating on the lay of the land beyond, as new hills and small depressions appeared with the passing of each traveled knoll. Except for the rushing of wind, the night remained silent. Flick listened intently, and once he thought he heard a sharp cry far to the north, but an instant later it was gone, and he did not hear it again. The stranger appeared to be unconcerned with the silence. His attention seemed to be focused on a constantly changing point in the ground some 6 feet in front of him. He did not look up, and he did not look at his young guide for directions as they went. Instead, he seemed to know exactly where the other was going and walked confidently beside him. After a while, Flick began to have trouble keeping pace with the tall man, who traveled the path with long, swinging strides that dwarfed Flick's shorter ones. At times, the Valeman almost had to run to keep up. Once or twice, the other man glanced down at a smaller companion, and, seeing the difficulty he was having in trying to match strides, slowed to an easier pace. Finally, as the southern slopes of the valley drew near, the hills began to level off into shrub-covered grasslands that hinted at the appearance of new forests. The terrain began to dip downward at a gentle slope, and Flick located several familiar landmarks that bounded the outskirts of Shady Vale. He felt a surge of relief in spite of himself. The hamlet and his own warm home were just ahead. The stranger did not speak a single word during the brief journey, and Flick was reluctant to attempt any conversation. Instead, he tried to study the giant in quick glimpses as they walked, without permitting the other to observe what he was doing. He was understandably odd. The long, craggy face, shaded by the sharp black beard, recalled the fearful warlocks described to him by stern elders before the glowing embers of a late evening fire when he was only a child. Most frightening were the stranger's eyes, or rather, the deep, dark caverns beneath the shaggy brows where his eyes should be. Flick couldn't penetrate the heavy shadows that continued to mask that entire area of his face. The deeply lined countenance seemed carved from stone, fixed and bowed slightly to the path before it. As Flick pondered the inscrutable visage, he suddenly realized that the stranger had never even mentioned his name. The two were on the outer lip of the vale, where the now clearly distinguishable path wound through large, crowded bushes that almost choked off human passage. The tall stranger stopped suddenly and stood perfectly still, head bowed, listening intently. Flick halted beside him and waited quietly, also listening, but unable to detect anything. They remained motionless for seemingly endless minutes, and then the big man turned hurriedly to his smaller companion. "Quickly! Hide in the bushes ahead! Go now! Run!" He half pushed, half threw Flick in front of him as he raced swiftly towards the tall bush. Flick scurried fearfully for the sanctuary of the shrubbery, his pack slapping wildly against his back and the metal implements clanging. The stranger turned on him and snatched the pack away, tucking it beneath the long robe. "Silence!" he hissed. "Run now, not a sound." They ran quickly to the dark wall of foliage some 50 feet ahead, and the tall man hurriedly pushed Flick through the leafy branches that whipped against their faces, pulling him roughly into the middle of a large clump of heavy brush, where they stood, breathing heavily. Flick glanced at his companion and saw that he was not looking through the bush at the country around them, but instead was peering upward, where the night sky was visible in small, irregular patches through the foliage. The sky seemed clear to the Valeman as he followed the other's intense gaze, and only the changeless stars winked back at him as he watched and waited. Minutes passed. Once he attempted to speak, but was quickly silenced by the strong hands of the stranger gripping his shoulders in warning. Flick remained standing, looking at the night and straining his ears for some sound of the apparent danger. But he heard nothing save their own heavy breathing and a quiet rush of wind through the weaving branches of their cover. Then, just as Flick prepared to ease his tired limbs by sitting, the sky was suddenly blotted out by something huge and black that floated overhead and then passed from sight. A moment later it passed again, circling slowly without seeming to move, its shadow hanging ominously above the two hidden travelers. A moment later it passed again, circling slowly without seeming to move, its shadow hanging ominously above the two hidden travelers as if preparing to fall upon them. A sudden feeling of terror raced through Flick's mind, trapping it in an iron web as it strained to flee the fearful madness penetrating inward. Something seemed to be reaching downward into his chest, slowly squeezing the air from his lungs, and he found himself gasping for breath. A vision passed sharply before him of a black image laced with red, of clawed hands and giant wings, of a thing so evil its very existence threatened his frail life. For an instant the young man thought he would scream, but the hand on the stranger gripped his shoulder tightly, pulling him back from the precipice. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the giant shadow was gone, and the peaceful sky of the night was all that remained. That sounded like a panic attack. The hand on Flick's shoulder slowly relaxed its grip, and the Valeman slid heavily to the ground, his body limp as he broke out in a cold sweat. The tall stranger seated himself quietly next to his companion, and a small smile crossed his face. He laid one long hand on Flick's and patted it as he would a child's. "Come now, my young friend," he whispered. "You're alive and well, and the Vale lies just ahead." Flick looked up at the other's calm face, his own eyes wide with fear as he shook his head slowly. "That thing! What was that terrible thing?" "Just a shadow," the man replied easily. But this is neither the place nor the time to concern ourselves with such matters. We will speak of it later. Right now, I would like some food and a warm fire before I lose all patience." He helped the Veilman to his feet and returned his pack to him. Then, with a sweep of his robed arm, he indicated that he was ready to follow if the other was ready to lead. They left the cover of the brush, Flick not without misgiving, as he glanced apprehensively at the night sky. It almost seemed as if the whole business had been the result of an overactive imagination. Flick pondered the matter solemnly and quickly decided that, whatever the case, he had had enough for one evening. First the nameless giant, and then that frightening shadow. He silently vowed that he would think twice before traveling again so far from the safety of the Vale. Several minutes later, the trees and brush began to thin out, and the flickering of yellow light was visible through the darkness. As they drew closer, the vague forms of buildings began to take shape as square and rectangular bulks in the gloom. The path widened into a smaller dirt road that led straight into the hamlet, and Flick smiled gratefully at the lights that shone in friendly greeting through the windows of the silent buildings. No one moved in the road ahead. If it had not been for the lights, one might as well have wondered if anyone at all lived in the Vale. As it was, Flick's thoughts were far from such questions. Already he was considering how much he ought to tell his father and Shay, not wishing to worry them about the strange shadows that could easily have been the product of his imagination and the gloomy night. The stranger at his side might shed some light on the subject at a later time, but so far he had not proved to be much of a conversationalist. Flick glanced involuntarily at the tall figure walking silently beside him. Again, he was chilled by the blackness of the man. It seemed to reflect from his cloak and hood over the bowed head and lean hands to shroud the entire figure in a hazy gloom. Whoever he was, Flick felt certain that he would be a dangerous enemy. They passed slowly between the buildings of the hamlet, and Flick could see torches burning through the wooden frames of the wide windows. The houses themselves were long, low structures, each containing only a ground floor with a slightly sloping roof, which in most instances tapered off on one side to shelter a small veranda supported by heavy poles affixed to a long porch. The buildings were constructed of wood, with stone foundations and stone frontings on a few. Flick glanced through the curtained windows, catching glimpses of the inhabitants, the sight of familiar faces reassuring him in the darkness outside. It had been a frightening night, and he was relieved to be home among people he knew. The stranger remained oblivious to everything. He did not bother with more than a casual glance at the hamlet, and had not spoken once since they entered the Vale. Flick remained incredulous at the way in which the other followed him. He wasn't following Flick at all, but seemed to know exactly where the Veilman was going. When the road branched off in opposite directions amid identical rows of houses, the tall man had no difficulty in determining the correct route, though he never once looked at Flick or even raised his head to study the road. Flick found himself trailing along while the other guided. The two quickly reached the inn. It was a large structure consisting of a main building and lounging porch, with two long wings that extended out and back on either side. It was constructed of huge logs cut and laced on a high stone foundation and covered with the familiar wood shingle roof, this particular roof much higher than those of the family dwellings. The central building was well lighted, and muffled voices could be heard from within, interspersed in occasional laughter and shouts. The wings of the inn were in darkness. It was there that the sleeping quarters of the guests were located. The smell of roasting meat permeated the night air, and Flick quickly led the way up the wooden steps of the long porch to the wide double doors at the center of the inn. The tall stranger followed without a word. Flick slid back the heavy metal door latch and pulled on the handles. The big door on the right swung open to admit them into a large lounging room, filled with benches, high-backed chairs, and several long, heavy wooden tables set against the wall to the left and rear. The room was brightly lit by the tall candles on the tables and wall racks, and by the huge fireplace built into the center of the wall on the left. Flick was momentarily blinded as his eyes adjusted to this new light. He squinted sharply, glancing past the fireplace and the lounging furniture to the closed double doors at the back of the room and over to the long serving bar running down the length of the wall to his right. The men gathered about the bar looked up idly as the pair entered the room, their faces registering undisguised amazement at the appearance of the tall stranger. But Flick's silent companion didn't seem to see them, and they quickly returned to their conversation and evening drinks, glancing back at the newcomers once or twice to see what they were going to do. The pair remained standing at the door for a few moments more as Flick looked around a second time at the faces of the small crowd to see if his father were present. The stranger motioned to the lounging chairs on the left. "I will have a seat while you find your father. Perhaps we can have dinner together when you return." Without further comment, he moved quietly away to a small table at the rear of the room and seated himself with his back to the men at the bar, his face bowed slightly and turned away from Flick. The Veilman watched him for a moment, then moved quickly to the double doors at the rear of the room and pushed through them to the hallway beyond. His father was probably in the kitchen having dinner with Shay. Flick hurried down the hall past several closed doors before reaching the one that opened into the inn kitchen. As he entered, the two cooks who were working at the rear of the room greeted the young man with a cheerful good evening. His father was seated at the end of a long counter at the left. As Flick had anticipated, he was in the process of finishing his dinner. He waved a brawny hand in greeting. "You're a bit later than usual, son," he growled pleasantly. "Come over here and have dinner while there's still something to eat." Flick walked over wearily, lowered the traveling pack to the floor with a slight clatter, and perched himself on one of the high counter stools. His father's large frame straightened itself as he shoved back the empty plate and looked quizzically at the other, his wide forehead wrinkling. "I met a traveler on the road coming into the valley," Flick explained hesitantly. "He wants a room and dinner. Asked us to join him." "Well, he came to the right place for a room," the elder Omsford declared. "I don't see why we shouldn't join him for a bite to eat. I can easily do with another helping." He raised his massive frame from the stool and signaled the cooks for 3 dinners. Flick looked about for Shay, but he was nowhere in sight. His father lumbered over to the cooks to give some special instructions on preparing the meal for the small party, and Flick turned to the basin next to the sink to wash off the dirt and grime from the road. When his father came over to him, Flick asked where his brother had gone. "Shay's gone out on an errand for me. Should return on the moment," his father replied. "By the way, what's the name of the man you brought back with you?" "I don't know. He didn't say," Flick shrugged. His father frowned and mumbled something about close-mouthed strangers, rounding off his muffled comment with a vow to have no more mysterious types at his inn. Then, motioning to his son, he led the way through the kitchen doors, his wide shoulders brushing the wall beyond as he swung to his left toward the lounging area. Flick followed quickly, his broad face wrinkled in doubt. The stranger was still sitting quietly, his back to the men gathered at the serving bar. When he heard the rear doors swing open, he shifted about slightly to catch a glimpse of the two who entered. The stranger studied the close resemblance between father and son. Both were of medium height and heavy build, with the same broad, placid faces and grizzled brown hair. They hesitated in the doorway, and Flick pointed toward the dark figure. He could see the surprise in Curzat Omsford's eyes as the innkeeper regarded him for a minute before approaching. The stranger stood up courteously, towering over the two as they came upon him. "Welcome to my inn, stranger," the elder Omsford greeted him, trying vainly to peer beneath the cloak hood that shadowed the other's dark face. "My name, as my boys probably already told you, is Curzat Omsford." The stranger shook the extended hand with a grip that caused the stocky man to grimace and then nodded to Flick. "Your son was kind enough to show me to this pleasant inn," he smiled, with what Flick could have sworn was a mocking grin. "I hope you will join me for dinner and a glass of beer." "Certainly," answered the innkeeper, lumbering past the other to a vacant chair where he seated himself heavily. Flick also pulled up a chair and sat down, his eyes still on the stranger, who was in the process of complimenting his father on having such a fine inn. The elder Omsford beamed with pleasure and nodded in satisfaction to Flick as he signaled one of the men at the serving bar for 3 glasses. The tall man did not pull back the hood of the cloak, shading his face. Flick wanted to peer beneath the shadows, but was afraid that the stranger would notice, and one such attempt had already earned him sore wrists and a healthy respect for the man's strength and temper. It was safer to remain in doubt. He sat in silence as the conversation between his father and the stranger lengthened from polite comments on the mildness of the weather to a more intimate discussion of the people and the happenings of the Vale. Flick noticed that his father, who never needed much encouragement anyway, was carrying the entire conversation with only casual questions interjected by the other man. It probably didn't matter, but the Omsfords knew nothing about the stranger. He had not even told them his name. Now he was quite subtly drawing out information on the whole Vale from the unsuspecting innkeeper. The whole situation bothered Flick, but he was uncertain what he should do. He began to wish Shay would appear and see what was happening, but his brother remained absent, and the long-awaited dinner was served and entirely consumed before one of the wide double doors at the front of the lobby swung open, and Shay appeared from out of the darkness. For the first time, Flick saw the hooded stranger take more than a passing interest in someone. Strong hands gripped the table as the black figure rose silently, towering over the Omsfords. He seemed to have forgotten they were there, as the lined brow furrowed more deeply and the craggy features radiated an intense concentration. For one frightening second, Flick believed that the stranger was somehow about to destroy Shay, but then the idea disappeared and was replaced with another. The man was searching his brother's mind. He stared intently at Shay, his deep, shaded eyes running quickly over the young man's slim countenance and slight build. He noted the telltale elven features immediately, the hint of slightly pointed ears beneath I think that's how you say it. Do you say tousled like that? Okay. Tousled blonde hair, the pencil-like eyebrows that ran straight up at a sharp angle from the bridge of his nose rather than across the brow, and the slimness of the nose and jaw. He saw intelligence and honesty in that face, and now as he faced Shay across the room, he saw determination in the penetrating blue eyes, determination that spread in a flush over the youthful features as the two men locked gazes on one another. For a moment, Shay hesitated in awe of the huge, dark apparition across the room. He felt unexplainably trapped, but, bracing himself with sudden resolve, he walked toward the forbidding figure. Flick and his father watched Shay approach them, his eyes still on the tall stranger, and then, as if suddenly realizing who he was, the two rose from the table. There was a moment of awkward silence as they faced one another, and then all the Omsfords began greeting each other at once in a sudden jumble of words that relieved the initial tension. Shay smiled to Flick, but could not take his eyes off the imposing figure before him. Shay was slightly shorter than his brother, and was therefore even more in the shadow of the stranger than Flick had been, though he was less nervous about it as he faced the man. Curzet Omsford was talking to him about his errand. His attention was momentarily diverted while he replied to his father's insistent questions. After a few preliminary remarks, Shay turned back to the newcomer of the Vale. "I don't believe we've met, yet you seem to know me from somewhere, and I have the strangest feeling that I should know you." The dark face above him nodded as the familiar mocking smile crossed it fleetingly. "Perhaps you should know me, though it is not surprising that you do not remember. I know who you are, indeed, I know you well." Shay was dumbfounded at this reply, and, unable to respond, stood staring at the stranger. The other raised a lean hand to his chin to stroke the small dark beard, glancing slowly around at the three men who waited for him to continue. Flick's open mouth was framing the question on the minds of all the Omsfords when the stranger reached up and pulled back the cowl of his cloak to reveal clearly the dark face, now framed by long black hair cut nearly shoulder-length and shading the deep-set eyes, which still showed only as black slits in the shadows beneath the heavy brows. "My name is Alanon," he announced quietly. There was a long moment of stunned silence as the three listeners stared in speechless amazement. Alanon, the mysterious wanderer of the Four Lands, historian of the races, philosopher and teacher, and, some said, practitioner of the mystic arts. Alanon, the man who had been everywhere, from the darkest havens of the Anar to the forbidden heights of the Charnel Mountains. His was a name familiar to the people of even the most isolated Southland communities. Now he stood unexpectedly before the Omsfords, none of whom had ventured outside their valley home more than a handful of times in their lives. Alanon smiled warmly for the first time, but inwardly he felt pity for them. The quiet existence they had known for so many years was finished, and, In a way, it was his responsibility. "What brings you here?" Shay asked at last. The tall man looked sharply at him and uttered a deep, low chuckle that caught them all by surprise. "You, Shay," he murmured. "I came looking for you." And that's the end of the chapter. I actually really enjoyed this chapter of the Sword of Shannara, especially because this book, if you haven't seen it, is gigantic. It looks like a mini tome, and I was really nervous about starting it because I hadn't read a book in a while. And that first chapter just pulled me in, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna end up stuck reading this until I am done. There's no way that I'm getting past, like, leaving this alone. Like, there's no way it's gonna happen. So it's really interesting that when I reread it, I notice like different things, obviously. But I do really enjoy the thing, and honestly, Al-Anon sounds kind of like a mood at this point. Even though, like, we've only heard him talking, but, like, I would like some food before I lose all patience. Dude, mood. That's the exact same thing that I felt that on a spiritual level. It's really awkward talking about this to my recorder. Anyway, like, how do you guys feel about the first chapter? Are you interested? What do you think about it? I thought it was pretty interesting. The chapters do get better as far as I feel, like, how I feel, and in terms of, like, action and stuff. I know that they get better, but so far, I think it's a good start to a book. I'm really happy and excited to read the next chapter with you guys, and yeah, I'm all for it. How did you guys feel about it? I would love to know your thoughts on the chapter and maybe like some guesses as to what happens next, but please keep spoilers out of the comments. I want people to have a fun experience reading it together, and spoilers are not very fun. Anyway, if there's anything that you think you would want me to read in the future, let me know. I'm all for suggestions. I have like a little list of books that I can, that I've been thinking of doing after this Sword of Shannara book, like in between, because this volume is gigantic. This volume is gigantic, and there is like a bajillion of them. So I was thinking of reading like a Shannara series book, and then I would read like a standalone book in between each one. But I don't know. I'm still thinking on that part. But let me know if you have any suggestions of what I should read on the channel, and I'm all happy for it. I'm always open to suggestions. Anyway, I enjoyed reading this with you. I hope you enjoyed reading it with me. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.